Hello, and welcome once again to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And I just want to give everyone a reminder, as always, that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors. So I would ask that if you have benefited from the materials that we produce, that you would consider becoming a contributor. You can go to justandsinner.org, go to our donate page there. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that any gifts that you give to us are tax deductible. Well, we are getting back into a series that I haven't done any videos on in quite a while. And this may be as confusing if you watch this actually in timeline order on the playlist here, but at least for those who are watching as these videos come out, it's been a while. And we are going to be discussing Gottfried Leibniz. So this is part of a broader series that is called Makers of the Modern World. And in this series, I explore some of the thinkers that have shaped the way that people think in contemporary society. And largely, I'm talking about the move away from classical ways of viewing the world to modern and then postmodern ways of viewing reality. So we are now starting a series of videos within the Makers of the Modern World series that's going to be exploring some things that are happening in Germany after the time of the Reformation. Now, these figures are more closely related to my actual field of study and research than most of the figures that I explore in this series, because my own area of expertise is in Lutheran theology, and in particular Lutheran scholasticism. And so we're going to be looking at the move away from scholasticism, looking at some figures in Germany in particular, though these things are happening not just in Germany, but beyond that throughout Europe as well. Okay, so we're talking here about Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and the birth of German rationalism. Okay, so let's talk a bit about Leibniz and who Leibniz was. Leibniz was born in Leipzig on July 1st, 1646. His father, Friedrich Leibniz, was a professor of moral philosophy, and he was also the dean of philosophy at the University of Leipzig. Now, as far as I can tell, and I can't find that much information about his father, Leibniz's father, but Leibniz's father, from what I can tell, appears to have been a kind of traditional Orthodox Lutheran, working much more in the kind of traditional scholastic mode. But Friedrich, Leibniz's father, died when Leibniz was only 6 years old, and so he was raised by his mother, not by his father. And so he didn't have this kind of more Lutheran Orthodox training, at least directly by his father throughout his life. However, Leibniz followed in his father's footsteps in pursuing an academic path. He learned Latin fluently by the age of 12. He was largely self-taught. He just enjoyed learning and did this from a very young age. And he used this knowledge to then begin reading the vast amounts of books in his father's library. And so his father, as a professor of philosophy, had a significant library. And what Leibniz read was, yes, from some of the certainly Lutheran orthodoxy of that era, but he also read those who were critical as well and coming from different philosophical perspectives. And so he was a voracious reader. He enrolled at the University of Leipzig at the age of 14, where he studied under his father's student, Jacob Thomasius. Now, the name Thomasius, if you know anything about theology or philosophy in the 17th century among Lutherans, the name Thomasius shows up over and over again. There are numerous Thomasiuses, and there's another very influential Thomasius in the 19th century. But this particular student, Jacob Thomasius, was an influential voice into Leibniz's life. Now, Leibniz would go on to teach Christian Thomasius, and Christian Thomasius is the most well-known Thomasius. He's also a figure we're going to be looking at in this series, who wrote a lot of influential work on moral philosophy, the philosophy of law, and political thought, natural law theory. Okay, so Leibniz wrote his bachelor's thesis on the subject of metaphysical individuation. And so it's in this thesis that he sets forth the idea that Leibniz is known for more than any other. This is kind of the core idea in Leibniz's thought, is this doctrine of the monads. And so we'll get into specifics about exactly what the monads are. But this thesis shows Leibniz to be an adherent to a nominalist metaphysic. And if you don't know much about nominalist metaphysics, I have some videos on the channel that address this, but in a very broad sense, there's a debate in the late medieval period between a group known as the nominalists and then the realists. There are a lot of things that are involved in nominalism, but what the name itself comes from is a denial of universals. Nominalism teaches that things are defined by their particulars. And so a realist would say that there are real universal things. So when we define something like, say, the color red or the shape triangle or a species, if you identify, say, a dog, those are not just names that we use to categorize things, but they have a real existence in themselves. They're a real something. And so the nominalists are going to say that these universal titles that we use to describe things are really more the product of linguistic or cognitive categories than they are actually receiving something in the real world. And so in other words, when we categorize things as, triangles, it's because we see a bunch of things that these various shapes and objects we encounter seem to have in common. And so it's a linguistic or cognitive category that we use to describe things. Whereas the realist is going to say, no, triangle is a real thing. It has a real essence, and that essence is shared in by all the things that we refer to as triangular. They have a unity that they share in the broader essence of triangularity. That's a very, very broad, probably totally inadequate definition, but you can find other videos on this channel that talk about that in a little more depth. But Leibniz is moving away with his idea of the monads from what was the predominant way of viewing metaphysics, the predominant way of viewing the basic elements of reality. And so if you look at this era following the Reformation, those who were in the Lutheran scholastic method, mode of thought, which dominated in Germany at this time, at least in Lutheran territories, those thinkers were realists. They assumed the existence of universals, the existence of essences. And Leibniz starts to move toward looking at the ultimate foundation of reality in the particular. And really, to get more specific, these very little, tiny particular things that he refers to as the monads. Leibniz then goes on to get a master's degree in law from the same institution. And then after he received this degree from Leipzig, he was dismissed, where he wanted to pursue a doctorate, and it was probably because of his young age. We don't know the exact reason, but he ended up receiving his doctorate from the University at Altdorf in 1666. He was only 20 years old. So he was certainly something of a prodigy, a childhood genius. So let's talk a bit about Leibniz's influences then, before we get into his thought. Who was it that impacted Leibniz's way of viewing reality and viewing the world and viewing God and the soul and all the things we'll be talking about here? Well, in 1672, Leibniz traveled to Paris, and while he was in Paris, he encountered the writings of the very influential René Descartes. And René Descartes is generally considered the father of modern philosophy. I have 2 videos in this series that go over René Descartes, which you can find if you're just listening to the podcast. You can find it on the podcast feed as well. So if you want to get some background on Descartes and what leads to the birth of modern philosophy. So Descartes is not really the first philosopher that's asking the kinds of questions that set the stage for modern philosophy, but he is the most influential of them. And so Leibniz encounters Descartes, and Descartes has a pretty significant influence on him. And then he also encounters the writings of Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal is most famously known for Pascal's wager. He was a Jansenist philosopher. Jansenism was a kind of reformatory movement within Roman Catholicism after the time of the Reformation, a very controversial movement, and one that often has been likened to Calvinism among the Protestants. But Pascal adopts many different ways of looking at philosophy than had previously been done in the past. He is influenced significantly by Pierre Chiron, who also has a significant influence on René Descartes. So he gets Leibniz asking some different questions and thinking in different categories. And so one of the elements of Descartes' thought in particular that compels Leibniz is Descartes' mechanistic view of nature, along with his denial of final causality or final causes. Now, Leibniz does have a kind of perception of final causes in a very different form, but not in its classical form. And Descartes essentially argues that nature is like a machine. The world is like a machine in that it has a bunch of parts, and these individual parts just operate as they operate. And like a machine is kind of predetermined, right? It has this predetermined path that you set it on when you create the machine. There's no autonomy in the machine to act on its own. So is the natural world. The natural world is governed by a series of laws that are definite and physical processes that are mechanistic, which means that in the natural world, things couldn't really be anything other than as they actually are. And so this starts to challenge the way that people have thought about human freedom and human decisions. Now, while he is in Paris, Leibniz also befriends Nicholas Malebranche, who is another highly influential thinker of this time. His years are 1638 to 1715, and then Antoine Arnauld, 1612 to 1694 are his dates. But Malebranche is the one that's probably most significant as well as most well known here. Now, Malebranche is a Roman Catholic, and so Leibniz at this time, as he is encountering Roman Catholic philosophy, he is starting to question, and I think there's probably some of this already, at least in his departure from traditional Lutheran metaphysics, but he's starting to question the separation of the Lutheran Church or the Lutheran Reformation from the Roman Church. And so something that's going to guide Leibniz in a significant way is this desire to unite all of Christendom. And so he's reading very widely across a variety of Christian traditions at this time, among Calvinists as well. But Malebranche, the Roman Catholic, is the most important. Malebranche was a priest. So Malebranche, in his thought, he synthesized the teaching of Descartes with earlier Roman Catholic thought. And what is particularly most important to understand for Leibniz's own system of thought is Malebranche's idea of what's called occasionalism. And Descartes, in describing nature and biology in general, the physical world, as a kind of predetermined machine with no freedom in itself, he has created this problem when it comes to the human being and the human perception that we seem to all have, that we are free, that we make our own decisions, and that when we think through actions, say, that we are going to take, our thoughts, our mental life, can and does often impact our physical behavior. And so what I do with my body is often the result of mental processes as we think through, a series of alternative paths that we may want to take. So how is it that we can have this seemingly free mind and also have bodies that are purely biologically predetermined, seemingly? Well, you have this problem that is called the mind-body problem. And so it's not just a question of freedom. I think that's where it probably comes out most practically when people start to question this. But there's another broader principle at work here. That is, Descartes believes in the soul, at least in some sense. And the mind is a thinking, it's a perceiving thing. There's a consciousness, intellect that we generally refer to as the soul, that is distinct from the physical body. And so we have these two very different kind of substances. We have this biological bodily substance that has mass, and then we have this other intellectual substance that is mind. Well, the question is, how is it that this biologically predetermined body that is a pure kind of machine or biological physical entity, how is it that that thing can relate to us as we are mental substances? How do the physical and the mental relate? They're two totally different kinds of things. Or you have to put this in more classical terms to say, how do the body and soul relate to one another? Because if the body is purely biological, if it's a machine, it can only be affected by other physical things. So how is it possibly affected by the soul, which is a totally different kind of thing and not seemingly a predetermined thing? So there are different ways to answer this problem of mind-body dualism, but Malebranche comes up with this idea called occasionalism. And occasionalism essentially says that there really is no interaction directly between the mind and the body, or the body and the soul. And what happens is that God basically works directly upon the body as the soul thinks, as the mental aspect of the self considers things and makes decisions. And so Malebranche would say that the soul can't, or the mind can't influence the body, but God intervenes so that there is this kind of miraculous connection between mind and body, because God is just making it happen. He's making the body do the things that it does when the soul makes the decisions that it does. And this is a very strange solution, but it is a solution. And it's one that starts Leibniz on a path of thinking through these issues, and he has his own kind of solution, which isn't really much of a solution either to this mind-body problem. Another element of Malebranche's thought that's really important is that he believed that the principles of ethics could be derived through pure rational contemplation, much like mathematical proofs. And so he believes that we can reason toward that which is morally good apart from God's revelation, whereas previous systems of thought discussed the moral law largely in terms of God's revelation. Now, they would say God reveals his moral law in two ways. That is through nature and supernature. So he reveals his law through nature, and that, yes, reason can come to some conclusions about what's right and wrong, but God has revealed his will and law and moral will most clearly in the revealed law, which is what we find outlined in the teachings of Scripture. And so there is this method of doing philosophy that is applied here in the system of ethics, but it's applied in all sorts of different fields, that you begin with a basic foundational principle, right? So you begin with an indisputable principle. This is what Descartes does. And this is really the core of rationalism. So the rationalists are going to say, we need to start with a core principle that we can agree on, that is correct. And then from that core principle, we can then deduce further principles. And then we can compare those principles together to form further conclusions. And so you start with some basic truth and then build a bunch of truths off of that through this purely rational process. Okay, then getting back to Leibniz's life beyond his influences, he spent some time in the Netherlands. He met with Baruch Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, someone I'd like to do in this series as well, but I haven't prepared that yet. And Spinoza was a very controversial figure at his time, and he had just finished writing his major ethics text and died not long after this visit. And Leibniz, later in life, recalls that at one point he was almost won over to Spinoza's system. He found it pretty compelling. However, this was really short-lived because Leibniz rejected Spinoza's departure from Christianity and from Christian orthodoxy. And so Leibniz, throughout his life, saw himself as a faithful Christian. He received a job as a courtier at the House of Brunswick, where he would continue his writing and studies, though it's not directly related to his job. He never got married, and he did upset the Brunswick family. I think that is for a couple of reasons, but one of those is that he had a major work that he was commissioned to write, which was a history of the family, and he was so particular about his work that he didn't quickly produce something because he wanted it to be done very well, which caused a lot of frustrations. What this eventually led to was that nobody in the family attended his funeral. The secretary actually did of the Brunswick family, but he wasn't, other than the secretary, nobody else was really there. And it's kind of an unfortunate and sad thing that he was buried in an unmarked grave. It was 50 years before the grave was marked as Leibniz's grave, which is so odd for someone who was so influential in the history of philosophy. Despite this, though, Leibniz was generally well-liked. If you read accounts of Leibniz and what people thought of him, they thought he was congenial and friendly, and people generally have quite positive things to say about him. Now, the question or one of the major questions that's going to be raised as we're talking about Leibniz is this question of what is his religious affiliation? Because Leibniz, he was, yes, primarily a philosopher, but he also said a lot about theology and the relation between theology and philosophy. Now, at this time, there isn't that strict of a division between the disciplines of theology and philosophy. And it is certainly recognized that they're not the same. However, it's often those who are professors of theology who teach philosophy classes and vice versa. They're strongly interrelated with one another. Now, as a citizen of Leipzig and as one whose father was a Lutheran, he just kind of was a Lutheran by default. But he was not a committed confessional Lutheran in the way that his father was, or many others were at this time. He believed, and increasingly believed this as he encountered more sources from various other traditions, that strict divisions between these Christian traditions were unnecessary. Now, Leibniz lives after the 30 Years' War. You just had a lot of bloody religious conflict at this time as well. So this is certainly in his mind, along with the minds of many other people. And Leibniz desired to unify Protestants with each other, so he tried to unify Calvinists and Lutherans. The attempt to do that was tried by many. George Calixtus, for example, tried to do this prior to Leibniz, and it generally has not worked. And he also tried to unify Protestants and Roman Catholics together, again, not successfully, and he wrote this book, Systema Theologicum. And in his system of theology, he defends Roman Catholic doctrines. And he's not defending Roman Catholic doctrines because he necessarily agrees with all of them, but he is trying to show his fellow Protestants that what the Roman Catholics believe about various doctrines is not totally irrational. There are good reasons for them believing the things that they do. And so his argument was not really to say one side is right or the other is right, but merely to say that everybody has good reasons for believing what they do. And so again, he desired a unity of Christendom. And so it's kind of hard to place him theologically. He's in a Lutheran church, but he's really just Lutheran because that's just kind of what he was. He's not very committed to Lutheran theology. By the end of his life, the accounts seem to say that Leibniz really was not very engaged in church life much at all. But despite that, in terms of just basic Christian orthodoxy, Leibniz was Trinitarian. He believed in the reality of sin, the need for redemption. He affirmed the truths of basic Christian creedal statements. And so in a very general sense, Leibniz retained Orthodox Christianity throughout his life. And this maybe seems a little bit odd to say that the father of rationalism was also an Orthodox Christian, but this is the case with a lot of the early rationalists of this time. It takes a bit of time for rationalism, other than Spinoza. Of course, Spinoza is another story, but the majority of rationalists, certainly in Germany, retained Christian orthodoxy for some distinct period of time. So what are Leibniz's writings or most influential writings? Now, Leibniz is kind of an odd thinker in that he didn't publish that much in his lifetime. And by that much, I mean that he had a lot of articles that were published in various places, a lot that were totally unreleased, but he didn't release a lot of major works, like full books. And so it's hard to find a direct treatment. There's nowhere that Leibniz just lays out all of his ideas in one place. It's not like you have a Critique of Pure Reason, which is one of Kant's major works. You don't have that kind of systematic treatment in Leibniz. So you do have to kind of bounce back and forth between various writings to understand Leibniz, which is one of the reasons why, to understand Leibniz, he's a figure where it's really helpful to read some secondary sources, treatments of Leibniz, because it's just so hard to piece together ideas from here or there, and there's no clear place to go. But some of his influential works: Discourse on Metaphysics, 1686, New Essays on Human Understanding, 1704, his Theodicy, 1710, his Monadology, 1714, and then his System of Theology, which I had just mentioned already, which was written in the 1680s, but not published until 1850. And there are several unprinted essays and personal letters. Now, most of this did end up getting published at some point in time. And so there's a bit of a renaissance in the 19th century of Leibniz's thought and writing as more things are published later in his life. And this led to a significant amount of debates on what Leibniz's theological convictions were because of that, the nature of that System of Theology book. So let's talk then about more specifics of Leibniz's system. And so we're going to start with his metaphysics. What are the basic elements of reality in Leibniz's view? For Leibniz, he's going to say that the key to all philosophy is having a right understanding of substance. And questions of substance or essence are really core to philosophy from its very foundation. And the earliest philosophers that we have any record of, the pre-Socratic philosophers, so those that come before Socrates and Plato, the records that we do have of their teachings indicate that they were largely concerned with this question of substance, this question of what is it that makes up reality. And so you have someone like Heraclitus, for example, who says that water, or the fire is the kind of primordial element that all things are made up of. Thales does this with water, and then you have others talking about how there are 4 different elements that make up all things. So the question is, what is the basic underlying principle of reality? Plato answers this question with this idea of the forms, or these eternal ideas, that underlying physical reality is an ideal reality, a reality that is in the realm of unchanging ideas rather than physical things. Later Christian Platonists are going to say that the underlying principle of reality is ideas that exist within the mind of God. And so he's addressing a question, Leibniz here, that has been asked and answered in many different ways. And these are ongoing debates in philosophy. They're still ongoing debates in philosophy today. And what you do with this question is ultimately really going to form so much of your whole philosophical system. So Leibniz is going to say the key to philosophy is getting this right and figuring out what exactly is substance. We talk about substances, what makes up things, what are things. In his view, he's going to say that there is really only one ultimate substance out of which all things arise. Now, what he doesn't mean by that is that all things are one. This is a view called monism, which would say that essentially all things are really the same thing, that difference is an illusion. And you find this with Heraclitus, who I just mentioned. That's not what he's saying, as we'll see here. And we'll talk specifically about what he means then. Substance, he's going to say, is self-moving. And so a substance moves itself. It is the reason for its own development or change. And so one of the other great questions of classical philosophy, along with the question of what is substance, or what is the relation between the universal and the particular, is what is the relation between time and reality, or change and constancy? And so some are going to say that change is an illusion. Parmenides is the famous exemplar of this view. Others are going to say that constancy is an illusion, and reality is change. That's what Heraclitus says. And so he's saying that these substances, or the substance that underlies all things, moves itself. And so he's going to say there is constancy, there is consistency in the world through this unifying substance, remaining the same substance. However, that substance does go through process of change, but not because it's changed by anything else, but by itself. It is self-moving. And so substance for Leibniz is defined by activity. Substance is that which acts. This is contrasted with Spinoza's view of substance, which is static. It is unchanging. And this is the same with Plato. Plato has this idea that there are these eternal ideas, and these eternal ideas are unchanging. They don't move, they don't change, they're always the same. And this is what makes them more foundational in reality than the physical things. So that, say if you have the idea of the concept of triangle, the concept itself, the idea of triangle is not going to change. However, the particular triangles might change that are in this world. You could have objects that are triangular that you break, or you mold into a different shape, or you burn up, or whatever you might do. However, the thing that remains unchanged is the form. And so Leibniz is going to depart from Plato on this to say that substance by its nature is action. And so he says substance has both individuality and infinite plurality. And so he's going to depart very strongly from a monistic view that says that all things are one. He's also going to depart then, as a result of that, from Spinoza's view. And Spinoza is a kind of pantheist, that all things exist in God and God is all things. And so he's kind of in some way a radical individualist when it comes to things or substances. And this is why I said he's really an adherent of nominalism from as soon as he starts to develop these kinds of ideas. And so these substances are individual, they're isolated, and they're infinite. So what is this underlying substance? This is what he calls the monads. And so this idea of the monads is the most significant element of Leibniz's thoughts. And if you think Leibniz, if you're talking to somebody who knows anything about Leibniz, talk to a philosophy professor, somebody just read some philosophy, if they know anything about Leibniz, they're going to say this word monad. Right? So they know at least this, if you know anything about him. And So these monads are this underlying substance, and they are plural. So there are many monads. There's not just one singular monad. Now, this idea of monads might sound familiar to somebody who's familiar with some of the classical philosophical debates, because it's very similar to a view from someone named Democritus. And Democritus, his years are 460-ish to 370. He was the father of this idea called atomism. Now, atomism, which is where our current word atom comes from, is the idea that all things can be broken up into these very small, undividable particles. And Democritus is trying to answer some of the same questions that Leibniz is here, where he says, okay, there's change in the world, but there's also constancy in the world. How do we make sense of all of this? We can't go to the view that would say that change is just an illusion. That seems obviously, evidently false. But we seemingly can't really go to the view that says that everything is just change, because it seems like there are things that are consistent. And so he says, well, the constancy is found in these universal things that are these tiny objects that he calls atoms. And so Leibniz draws a lot on atomism, but he has a different kind of form of atomism. And so he believes that what he is doing in his thought is combining atomism with idealism. Idealism is the view that says that ideas are the ultimate reality. And so Plato is an idealist. So when you hear people use the phrase German idealism, which is a very common phrase that's going to be used to categorize all sorts of German thinkers, through someone like Hegel, Leibniz is really the first of the German idealists. And so he believes that Plato is right in that the ultimate reality is not material, but it's ideal, it's the realm of ideas, but that the atomists are right that all of reality is made up of these particular things. He's not calling them atoms here, he calls them monads. And so the monads are more like souls than they are like material objects. And so for the atomists, these are clearly material things that make everything up. But for Leibniz, he's going to say they're not really material, they're ideal, they're like souls, they're living in some sense. And it's for this reason that sometimes Leibniz has been referred to as the father of panpsychism. Panpsychism is the idea that there is a kind of consciousness that is spread throughout all matter in life, that is an essential part of matter. But we won't get too far into that, just a kind of a footnote here. So what exactly are these monads like? Let's talk about some of their characteristics. The first is that they're indivisible. You cannot divide them. And so they are inherently and necessarily the smallest element, the most basic element of reality. You can't break reality up any further into them because they're totally indivisible. These monads don't really impact each other. And this is what's going to be, I think, very difficult for Leibniz's system, but it's really essential to understand in his system. Nothing can enter into the monads, and nothing can go out of the monads. And so this means that the movement that we see in the world is really not the process of things really interacting with one another. These monads don't really interact with one another. They're self-contained. And these monads, as I said, they're self-movers in some way, but it's not because these monads have, say, a free will and they're choosing to do this or that, but they're on a kind of predetermined course to develop in a certain way and do certain things. And so every monad contains its own future actions within it. And this then relates to what we talked about briefly with Descartes, with this more mechanistic view of nature, where he's saying that things just kind of operate in a predetermined way, according to the course of nature, as they are destined to. These monads do exactly that. So they're so self-contained, such that if all the monads just cease to exist except for one singular monad, it would act exactly in the same way that it would otherwise. Leibniz then speaks of these monads as mirrors. They're a kind of mirror of existence or of reality. They're a microcosm of all existence contained in these monads. Now, so the monads do contain the same kind of infinity of existence within them, but they do so in different ways. and thus they are all distinct. So he's going to say that no two monads are alike at all. Every single one is absolutely unique. So this then leads us to the next question, which is related to this, which is, well, how does God play into this picture? As I said, Leibniz considers himself an Orthodox Christian, and so the question, where does God fit into the system, is important because he has to fit somewhere. Now he's going to say that there is a relation between God and the monads. There's a similarity between God and the monads. God is referred to often as like the ultimate monad. While both God and the monads represent infinity, the infinity of existence, God does this in an infinite way, while the monads do this in a finite way. And so the distinction between God and creation is going to be largely portrayed by Leibniz in this context of infinity. He'll use perfection as well, but largely infinity. So God is the infinite, humanity is the finite, and all creation is finite. And so there is a kind of metaphysical finitude that everything other than God has, because it only reflects the infinity of existence in a particular way, as it is limited by these other monads that contain this infinity of existence in different ways. Another way that he speaks is he says that God contains the universe in himself eminently, while the monads do so virtually. That language is from a letter to Bayle on December 5th, 1702. Okay. He does use some more classical language at times to refer to God, but also to refer to just his metaphysical system in general. And so if you're familiar with that more scholastic terminology of someone like a Thomas Aquinas, or the Protestant scholastics, the Lutheran scholastics, you're going to recognize some of the language that Leibniz uses, but he doesn't always mean it in exactly the same way as older sources did. But I do think that it's important to see that Leibniz is not really intending to totally depart from past systems. And this is true with a lot of these initial German rationalists, is that they're kind of trying in some way to reconcile this new thinking with more classical categories to some degree at least. And so he refers to God as pure act. This is actus purus. This is very common language within Thomas Aquinas and the tradition that follows him, which says that all things other than God are a mixture of act and potentiality. We all have potentials to be or do certain things that we are not actively doing or being at the moment. However, that is not true with God. God does not have any potentials that are not actualized. He is purely actualized. He is pure act. Now, since Leibniz is defining substance by its action, if God is the ultimate monad or the source of essence in all things, then it makes sense that God would be pure actuality. And the monads, however, in contrast to God, contain both action and passivity, which is a kind of restraint and limitation on them. And so they're not pure act. They have both act and passivity, potentiality, we would say in more classical language, which is similar to what Leibniz is getting at here. Activity is referred to as substantial form. Well, he uses this language of passivity to refer, he uses this language of prime matter to refer to passivity. Again, that's a use of an older term that one finds in the scholastic tradition, but it doesn't quite fit here with what is generally historically meant by that. This incorporation of substantial forms differentiates monads from atoms, which are pure matter, right? So we're saying that there is this unity between substantial forms and the monads as act, and so they are not purely material things. The connection that Leibniz makes between the passivity of these monads and pure matter here shows that something about his view of matter, because what he's going to say is that matter is not essentially really a different kind of thing than ideas are. But he's going to say that matter is really a kind of composite of monads that contain this passivity within them. And if they were not passive at all, they would be pure spirit. Okay, so we've already talked a little bit about this. God is the primitive and highest monad, the highest of all monads. God is not really contrasted with matter, so it's not so much a like maybe the Gnostics would do, of there's the immaterial God with the material things or the material world. And that kind of contrast between spirit and matter is there within Descartes' system to some degree, or Descartes' system at the very least leads to that by defining the kind of soul substance as something so different than the physical bodily substance. But for Leibniz, God is not really contrasted with the physical or with matter, but with nothingness. So matter is this kind of middle way, this via media between God as the prime monad, the source of reality, and then non-existence. And so you have to have kind of action and passivity together to have matter. Pure act is God, and then pure passivity would be non-existence. And so matter is a mixture of both of these things. And so he's trying to overcome this strong dualism. He's trying to overcome this strong division between matter and spirit, and he does it in this way. There's this then idea of harmony that shows up that we're going to get a little more into, where, okay, so God is the creator of the monads. Okay, so that's clear. And so it's not like there are a bunch of monads that just exist eternally and God is the highest of them. No, God actually creates the monads. So he does believe in a real creation. And again, he's consistent with a lot of, or wants to be consistent at least, with a lot of the basic truths of Orthodox Christian views, theological views and creedal views. So he's going to say that the creation of the monads by God, the ultimate highest monad, is what leads to harmony among the monads. And so this is what's going to kind of resolve the inevitable problem, which is, well, if you have just a bunch of isolated monads that just kind of do their own thing, how is it that there's any causality in the world? How is it that things have any regularity or things aren't just pure chaos? If things are the ultimate elements of reality aren't really interacting with each other. This doesn't seem to really make sense. He's going to say, well, because they're created in a very particular way by God, that they would act in the way that they do. He's going to say that God acts of necessity. And this is going to lead to a pretty significant, I think, theological issue here with God and divine freedom. But he's going to say God acts of necessity. He could not have done otherwise than what he actually did and does. He does use some proofs for the existence of God, and he relies on two proofs. And I'm just not getting into these because I think that would take kind of probably a separate little video. Maybe I'll do that, but I thought it would take too long. I have so much to cover here. But the first of these is the ontological proof of God's existence. And so he has a form of St. Anselm's argument, which argues from the definition of God that God exists. And the second is an argument based on sufficient reason. Now, sufficient reason is a very strong principle in Leibniz's thought. He's going to say essentially that everything that exists needs to have a sufficient reason for its being. And so ultimately there has to be one reason for the existence of other things. If you find a reason for one thing, for another thing, ultimately there's kind of one prime reason. And that he defines as God. Okay, there's a lot more to that argument. I think the argument is actually a lot stronger than it sounds like it is from just a quick overview, but that would have to be a separate video. So let me know if you want me to do that. Let's talk a little more about this idea of harmony, though, because this is really key to Leibniz's system, and I think it also shows the weakness of Leibniz's system. So how do the body and the soul interact? So how does the material substance and the intellectual substance, the mind, interact? We talked about this already. This is Descartes' mind-body problem. And Leibniz rejects traditional views, and traditional views are going to say that there is just an interaction between the soul and the body. And so in a more classical view, we're not really going to talk about two totally separate substances, and we're not going to talk about matter as purely a pure machine. But when that kind of mechanistic view of nature enters into the conversation, that becomes a lot more difficult with if you take that perspective taken from Descartes. And so in a traditional view, we're going to say things like, well, the intellect can cause your body to move, or your bodily movements can cause intellectual change and apprehension. There's this just vast interrelation between the two. And so he rejects this more traditional view, but he also then rejects the occasionalism view, which is the one we talked about in Malebranche, in which God directly intervenes to make the body act in accord with the soul. So they're not actually interacting. And so God then becomes the efficient cause of all things. And so traditionally in theology, there has been a distinction between primary and secondary causality. We'd say that God is the efficient cause of all things. He's the one that gives motion to all things. However, that does not mean that God is the only cause, because God works through means. He works through people. He works through historical circumstances, and he works through machines and nature and all sorts of other things. And so those are secondary causes. Though God gives motion to things and upholds things in their existence, things actually interact with one another. And so the occasionalist view rejects secondary causes and says there are only primary causes. So this is where Leibniz posits his harmony view, through which distinct monads act in consort with one another because God has just predetermined them to do so, so that these things have the appearance of affecting each other, though they don't actually do that. They just do whatever they are predetermined to do without actually interacting or intervening with one another. But unlike occasionalism, this isn't something that needs constant miraculous intervention. God just created the monads, and they are kind of in some way self-sufficient, because God has already set the course within them for them to do as they do. And so God isn't really so actively involved in upholding them in the way that he would be either within a classical view or within an occasionalist perspective here. So he uses this analogy to talk about this. Well, it's a body and soul, but it doesn't have to just be body and soul, but primarily that's where the debate is. So he says it's like two clocks that are set to the same time, and they're operating along the same trajectory, though they don't have any direct causal connection to one another. And so they're just aligned in what they're doing. They're doing the same thing at the same time, but they're not actually affecting one another at all. And so he says this is what's going on with the human person, or just objects and change in the world in general. So he rejects a strong body and soul distinction, since everything is made up of monads, and he's trying to resolve this strong dichotomy, supposed dichotomy from Descartes. And so souls are monads, souls are singular monads, and bodies are an aggregate of monads. And so he's going to say that, yes, the body is, or physical things in general, that which is material, is an aggregate of various monads with action and passivity together. Okay, so he distinguishes between a substance and a composite substance. So a simple substance is the soul, composite substance, the body. Now, there is an inconsistency that's been pointed out here, that Leibniz seems at times to speak of bodies as if they're mere phenomena, meaning that they don't really exist, right? Bodies are more appearance than anything else. Well, other times he talks about monads themselves as being corporeal or bodily, which doesn't really seem to fit other things that he's said. And the language that's used here shows up in some of his correspondence, his letters, so he doesn't really have a chance to really explain himself. But it has led to some kind of dilemmas in interpreting exactly what Leibniz means. Another one of the most kind of unusual, I guess, areas of Leibniz's philosophy, and most of his philosophy is pretty unusual, is this notion of the best of all possible worlds. Okay, so first he's gonna counter Spinoza, and Spinoza says that essentially everything that is possible is going to become actual. Possibilities always become actualities. And he's going to say no, Leibniz is going to say no. He's going to say not everything that's possible actually becomes actual. And that he makes a distinction between the possible and what he calls the compossible. So for something to be compossible, it must be consistent with everything else. So the monads, for one monad to have a possibility of doing something, is different from it having the compossibility. Because the compossibility says, okay, is it consistent with this monad to do this if this monad is doing this? So we have to talk not just about possibility, but compossibility. So something must be consistent with everything else for it to happen. So some things are possible in themselves, but are not possible in relation to other things. And Leibniz is going to say that the world is the combination of all that is compossible. There is no omission or lack in the composition of all monads and events in the world. Therefore, the world in the form that it exists is the best of all possible worlds. That seems like quite a strange claim. I don't think most people living in the world look at the situations around them and the world around them and think this is the best. This is the best there could be. But let's look a little more specifically at how this argument is laid out. So here he's going to define God as infinite perfection. And as I said, the two things that Leibniz uses to define God are infinity and perfection. And so here he combines them to say God is, by definition, he is infinite perfection. Now, a perfect being can only act in ways that are perfect. If a perfect being were to act in an imperfect way, he would seemingly be imperfect. So if God is perfect, that means he must act in a way that is perfect. Now, the creation of the world, the creation of the monads, is an act of the perfect being. Therefore, the creation of the world must itself be perfect, because a perfect being can only do perfect things. And so creation itself must be perfect. Now, if the world is perfect, that means that there must be no other possible world that could even theoretically be greater than the present one, as nothing can possibly be greater than perfection. Therefore, the world as it exists is the greatest of all possible worlds. All right, again, you see the logic of the argument here, but the argument doesn't really seem to make sense with our experience. and this is a point that's going to be pointed out against Leibniz. And that's just, yes, from the orthodox opponents of Leibniz, but it's also going to come from the empiricists and other philosophical traditions, as they're going to say, this shows the fact that reason by itself, and this method of philosophizing, by taking basic principles and just reasoning mathematically from there, doesn't seem to arrive always at conclusions that cohere with our actual experience. And so there must be a problem within the rationalist method as a whole. If all we're doing is reasoning from these base principles, and if we end up in a place by saying that this world full of death and sickness is the best of all possible worlds, how does that, these two things don't seem consistent, doesn't seem consistent with our experience. So that's been a continual challenge for Leibniz's system. All right, let's talk about then a little more about what he thinks about the human being. And one of the areas where Leibniz is really influential in later development of later academic disciplines is in his early psychology. It's kind of psychoanalysis even, maybe, that he engages in it sometimes, and he calls this pneumatics. And so it's just important to point out. But he makes a distinction between humans and animals, as philosophers generally do, and theologians certainly do. So what is the difference between a human and then the lower animals? Well, the first thing is that the human soul, which is a monad, controls far more complex systems than that of the animals. He also says that the human soul has this unique capacity to reflect upon itself. It has the unique capacity to be able to reason toward truths based on general principles, as he is doing here. In terms of where human ideas come from, here he's got another challenge with his system of monads. So generally, when we think about where ideas come from, I think most people would probably agree that they come to some extent from the outside. We learn things. Our interactions with the world actually imprint knowledge upon our minds. There have been philosophers that have rejected this. Plato, for example, believes that we have this knowledge that is part of a pre-existent life. We have these pre-existent souls that have all knowledge, and knowledge, learning is essentially recollection. So there are people in history that have made these kinds of arguments. And Leibniz has to go there because he's saying that nothing can come in or go out of a monad. They don't really interact with each other, which means that you can't get knowledge from another monad. So my soul can't really derive knowledge from other things. It can't derive knowledge from my sense experience. And so it must already, in some sense, already have that knowledge. It must be innate in my monad, my soul. And so as I grow in knowledge, that's really just the developmental process of the monad. That's the direction it's already going. And so he's going to say even sensations, even the sensations or inner feelings that you have, the qualia, the what it is likeness of your interactions with the world, those kinds of things, Leibniz is going to say, are in some way innate. And so it's really just the coordination of the monads that, like, when I touch my desk and feel the feeling of wood, that feeling that I have is just innate to the monad that is my soul, and it's inevitable that it's going to develop in that way. Consciousness, he's going to say, arises from small perceptions, which are then aggregated to create self-awareness, which then creates reason, which again is a uniqueness of humans among animals. So what exactly is reason in Leibniz's system? Like Descartes, he is going to say that reasoning is always dependent upon certain principles. And by certain principles, I mean principles that are absolute, one is absolutely sure of. These are things that are definitively true. And if you start with definitively true principles, you can reason from there toward other things which are true. And so you start with the base principle. For Descartes, it's his own existence. I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, and then you take that and then you start to reason from that. And so you see this with Leibniz where he talks about God's perfection. Oh, well, if God is a perfect being, then we can make all these conclusions based on this general principle that we have outlined. He has two principles that govern reasoning that he believes govern all logical and good reasoning. The first is the law of non-contradiction, and that's pretty familiar to most people, which essentially says a thing cannot be both A and not A in exactly the same way at exactly the same time. The second primary principle is the principle of sufficient reason, which he develops quite a bit. Everything that exists must have a reason for its existence. Every happening must have a reason for it. There must be an explanation for things. Reasoning, in his view, again, this shows up in Descartes as well, should always begin with that which is the most simple, the most basic, and then argue toward the more complex, right? So if you start with a very basic principle, I exist, then you start to build more and more complex things off of that, claims off of that, proofs off of that. On the other hand, the kind of analytical reasoning, right, where you're taking apart reasoning or evaluating something, that, if you look at a big problem, you shouldn't just try to tackle the big problem by itself, but instead you should try to break that down into a bunch of smaller problems. And then you work through the smaller problems first, and then by working through the smaller problems, you can arrive then at a conclusion about the larger problem. This also, again, is a part of Descartes' method. He's going to say about truth that truth is harmonious agreement. This idea of harmony shows up again. But it's harmonious agreement amid distinction. And he has this view because he believes that there is this kind of infinite plurality and individuality. And so reality is made up of this plurality and individuality working in harmony together. And so this, if that's what reality is, and truth is pointing toward the reality, truth is always going to be that. He also, and though he doesn't develop this very much, he does apply this, or begins to apply this to beauty at different points as well, to say that there is this connection between beauty and truth. That as there is distinction and harmonious agreement, this is what creates beautiful music. And this could be the case in the visual arts as well. Leibniz believed that faith and reason were not in opposition to one another. And he also did, and this may be surprising because of some of the other things that he does and says, he does acknowledge that there are divine truths that transcend reason. But he's going to say they're not irrational truths, but they transcend the human ability to reason due to the limitations of the human intellect. And so because he has this perception, this very strong perception of God's infinity, and this corresponding strong idea of human finitude, he is going to come to a conclusion that would say that the finite cannot totally grasp the reality of the infinite, so that there are things that are beyond our rational contemplation. And so he is going to be a bit different from a group like the Socinians, who are more pure rationalists in a theological sense than Leibniz is. Now, his view on the will. Leibniz's view is essentially deterministic. And this is an inevitable part of his view of the monads and of harmony, that an individual could not possibly act otherwise than he actually does. The individual does, for him, still will actions, though. He would say that we are not, because monads act in themselves without influence from anything else, he's going to say that this doesn't get rid of moral responsibility, because even though it's kind of destined that your soul is going to make the choices that it does, your soul is not compulsed to make those choices. Your will is not compulsed by anything external to it to make those choices. And so you are still going to will things as a result of your desires. So you actually do will things, but you couldn't will otherwise. This is what's known as compatibilism, this idea that there is a compatibility between a kind of determinism in your actions as well as human responsibility. And so nothing outside of an individual wills their actions, but that of their freedom, but their freedom and a determined course or set of actions are compatible with one another. Now, This does, of course, have significant implications for the realm of ethics, and there are others that develop an ethical system largely from Leibniz's view and some more depth than Leibniz himself does. But when we talk about the will then and its relation to the ethical or moral responsibility, there are three stages for Leibniz of the movement of the will. So the first stage is that an individual has feelings of discomfort, or comfort, but discomfort. Second, the person evaluates perceived pleasure that is seen as good and perceived pain, which is seen as evil. So we have this automatic connection in our minds between pleasure as a good and pain as something that is evil. And then the third element of the will in ethical decision-making is that we then exercise our rational nature to act upon these distinct perceptions. And this is where we make the ethical choices. Now, Leibniz is going to make a move that really defines rationalism throughout the modern era. And this finds its height probably in Kant. And that is, he's going to make this very strong connection between freedom and rationality. So that the more rational one is, the more free one is. The more free one is, the more rational one is. And freedom and rationality become the kind of two great goods that define the perfection of human nature, that many Enlightenment thinkers are seeking after, striving after. They think they should guide our actions, this pursuit of freedom and this pursuit of rationality. Now, if reason is used rightly for Leibniz, it leads to the conclusion that joy is found, or the good is found, not just in your own pleasure, but also in enjoying the pleasure of others. And so this kind of enjoyment of the satisfaction of others then serves as the broad rational principle for moral actions. And so, like other forms of reasoning, he's going to say that ethics derives from basic principles that one reasons from there. And you see this more developed in someone like Christian Wolff, who we're going to be looking at here, who was really more influential than Leibniz at his time, though he's not nearly as well known as Leibniz, but he's the one who really introduces and develops Leibniz's thought to develop what is the first modern German school of philosophy, which is the Wolffian school, sometimes called the Leibnizian Wolffian school. But Leibniz actually doesn't have as many direct followers as Wolff does. Ethics can be divided into three different stages. The first stage is strict law. This is just, there's right and wrong. Equity or fairness is the second stage, and then the third is piety. Okay, well, that is our summary of Leibniz's system, and let's just conclude here by talking a little bit about what some of his influence is on philosophy coming after him. Well, the most significant thing that he does is he brings rationalism into the German Academy. And as I said, this is especially through Christian Wolff, who was more influential than Leibniz himself is. And so rationalism at this time was largely French, though not exclusively French. And now it had come to influence the academy in Germany, would eventually take over the academy in Germany, especially through Halle in the early 18th century. He revitalized nominalism, philosophical nominalism, which was a serious departure from the Aristotelian dominance of German scholasticism, which prevailed in universities throughout Germany. A number of philosophers right after Leibniz's death wrote defenses of his doctrine of the monads. And so there are a number of 18th century works that defend Leibniz. It's even said that some preachers used Leibniz's language in their sermons, and they talked about God as the great monad. And supposedly, again, this is really from Wolff, though not directly from Leibniz. Alexander Baumgarten, another hugely influential figure, which we may talk about here as well, 1714 to 1762. His widely used Metaphysica, which was a standard philosophical text at this time, though again, not really well known today, but very influential at the time, it relied heavily on Leibniz's philosophy, and the Metaphysica was a far more comprehensive treatment and thorough treatment of metaphysics than one finds directly in Leibniz. And so in many ways, his influence is really most strongly felt through those who he influenced rather than his own ideas themselves. Though today, people don't tend to know Baumgarten or Wolff or Christian Thomasius or these other people that he had this significant impact over, but tend to know at least maybe generally who Leibniz is. The final point here is that his possible world semantics remains very popular today. And so we talked in his Doctrine of God that he speaks about this perfection of the world, that God considered basically all the possibilities of what could be the case, and then made the world that was the perfect one, the greatest of all the possibilities. And so in logic today among analytic philosophers, this kind of argumentation is often used. They speak about possible worlds. And we could talk about that at another time. That leads us kind of in a totally different direction. But the point is, he still has some significant influence even today. Okay, well, in the next part of this, we're going to be exploring some of these other thinkers that led to the decline of scholasticism, particularly in Germany. And this is really most important for me. It matters most to me, really, because I studied Lutheran scholasticism, and I think it's important to understand why it is that the dominance of scholasticism within the academy in Germany, but again, it's not just in Germany. Things are happening everywhere. But what causes this, and which then leads to the decline of theological orthodoxy within the Lutheran Church, and those who are more schooled in, say, the Reformed Church, would be interesting to know kind of, I don't know, where you see this or what figures you see impacting these ideas or movements most broadly in those spheres. So thanks so much. Make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video. God bless.